I'm really honored to introduce Dr. Michelle Fine, who's one of my academic heroes for her fearless work using critical feminist methods to document and explore issues of privilege and dispossession, resistance and desire, representation and identity, and educational justice and injustice. Dr. Fine's Distinguished Professor of Social Psychology, Women's Studies, and Urban Education at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. She's a recipient of multiple grants, contracts, fellowships, honorary degrees, and awards, most recently the Henry Murray Award from the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, and the Elizabeth Hurlock Beckman Award for her mentoring and activist activities in higher education. Dr. Fine is the author of 21 books, 79 chapters, and 95 articles, unless I lost count as I was going through. But from one qualitative researcher to another, numbers don't begin to describe her contributions to psychology, to her research participants, to her students, and to society. So to give you a taste of the range of her scholarship and the consistency of her commitments to confronting oppression and celebrating and cultivating resistance, some of her titles include Revolutionizing Education, Muslim American Youth, Understanding Hyphenated Identities Through Multiple Methods, Oversexed and Under Surveillance, Off-White, Essays on Race, Power, and Resistance, and Disruptive Voices, Transgressive Possibilities of Feminist Research. As you can imagine from these titles, there are any number of fascinating topics of which she could speak to us this afternoon, but we're very pleased to have Dr. Fine here today to speak on Critical Psychology Confronts Racialized Crises, activist research on the school-to-prison pipeline and the prison-to-college pipeline. Dr. Fine, thank you.
So how many of you are just here for extra credit? No, I'm just kidding. Hi, it's really wonderful to be here. UMBC, you might or might not know, is nationally recognized as one of the amazing, dedicated public institutions, probably because you have the coolest president, who is really one of the few public spokespeople for what public education should be and must be. And when he speaks about excellence and equity like they are redundant with one another. I wish we could kind of bottle his point of view and make it a bit more popular in this country. So it's a pleasure to be here. On Friday, April 27th, 500 students walked out of Western International High School, which is a public high school in Detroit, and they walked out in solidarity with their colleagues at Southwest Detroit High School, because Detroit is going through a campaign of closing schools. Right? Is that happening here in Baltimore? School closings? So school closings is a national phenomenon. It's happening very much in New York City, where schools, particularly in low-income Black and Latino communities, are now being evaluated on the basis primarily of high-stakes testing, and then they get closed, and they often get reopened for a different crowd of students, and then success is declared. In Tucson, Arizona, students and faculty, high school and college, are reading banned books on the streets. Anybody know why? Tucson Board of Education banned a set of books from being taught in the public schools, any books that challenged patriotism, including books like Rethinking Columbus, La Raza, Paulo Freire, right? So educators and students are standing on street corners and in parks reading aloud from these texts. In New York City tomorrow, millions of students are declaring a strike, but more than that, they're declaring a collective educational experiment where education is moving to every park in the city, and educators and young people will be teaching for what will be called the Free University on May Day. One might ask, when did public become a four-letter word? We have witnessed recently a dramatic fiscal and ideological makeover of the public sphere, a grotesque demonization of public workers and public education students, and a shredding of budgets, all in the name of austerity. Perhaps some of you have noticed your debt rising. Anybody? Okay. Across the country, public officials have chosen to protect the wealthiest and corporate tax benefits and transferring the economic pain onto already burdened poor, working class, and low-income communities. All of this in austerity, in drag as austerity. The economic crisis is being represented as natural and inevitable, and the solution is that unfortunately we have to further tax the poor and working class. On every measure of social life in this country, inequality gaps are growing. And in a wonderful book by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett called The Spirit Level, I highly recommend it. They are British epidemiologists. What they've done is lined up nations by the size of the inequality gap, and then within nation states and within state cities. The United States has the highest inequality gap of their calculations in the world. New York State has the largest inequality state by gaps. New York City, the most substantial inequality gap within our state. And the Upper West Side, anybody know New York? The Upper West Side, the highest inequality gap, which will become relevant in a moment. Former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich keeps reminding us that the wealthiest 1% owns at least 25% of privately held wealth, while law professor Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, tells us there are more black men in prison today than there were enslaved in 1850. And the Chronicle of Higher Ed continues to report that financial aid to higher education is in jeopardy for low-income youth, and shamefully unavailable to those students considered undocumented. The media circulates caricatures of K-12 schools and public universities, distributing images of incompetence and greed and educators with criminal records. Periodically, we hear about the fat pensions of public university professors. Anybody here have a fat pension? And the tragedy of the inefficiency of the public university. These media distribute test scores as though they are true, graduation rates as though they actually measure something about quality of institutions. And all of this data is quietly lubricating a world where public education is being privatized. Enter a new regime of power brokers, politicians, corporations, philanthropists. They are creating a new common sense that convinces people that private is better than public. As the logic goes, the public sector is inefficient and the market will save us. This is an old story in this country. W.E.B. Du Bois had a magazine in 1903 called The Crisis, and The Crisis was dedicating to chronicling the pain and the injustice in the black community. But Du Bois was no fool and remarked that the rest of the nation would only notice the crisis when there was a profit to be made. And I fear we were at that moment. So the question for me, and the question I want to bring to us today is, what's our obligation? As public educators, what is our obligation and what is our debt to this new moment in which we survive, where public education is being privatized? And I want to argue that our debt is what I'm going to call critical research for advocacy. And I want to give you some images, but before I go to images of public research, I want to give you two images that I hold in my mind to remind us of what the public might be. One is from a science writer named Janine Benes. Anybody know her? You can go on TED, TED online. She has a fabulous 45-minute riff. She's a science writer who looks at social problems and says, how does nature solve this? So she went down to Katrina and she figured out why some trees fell and why others stood strong. Some trees are called sacrifice trees. They're the ones that go down first. Some people might argue our cities are our sacrifice trees. But she was interested in which trees stand strong and sturdy and what allows them to stand strong and sturdy. And what she found is that the mighty oak stands tall as though it is alone. But if you go underground, what you find is that it has deep, complex roots that snuggle up against each other, holding it up. So for me, that's what the public sector is, and that's what public education must be. Those deep roots where we hold each other up, even the sacrificed trees. I have one more science example for those of you who are science types. I'm not standing up to do science, I'm standing up to the public. It's an evolutionary biologist by the name of Sylvia Kremer. She's in Austria, and she studies ants. Ants are profoundly social insects. And when one ant has smallpox, the other ants lick it clean until it is healthy. They don't say, ooh, you have smallpox. And what happens is that that ant gets better, but their collective immunity rises. Right? So let us hold those two images of public as I take you on a little journey of what public science might look like, to think through what is our obligation in these days of privatization. To do this work, I stand on the shoulders of some amazing psychologists and sociologists whose legacy gets buried a bit. My first hero for today is W.E.B. Du Bois. People know Du Bois's book, The Philadelphia Negro. So really important. I have a lot of reading for you to do this summer. Philadelphia Negro was written at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. Susan Wharton of the Wharton School family hired W.E.B. Du Bois to study what she called the Negro problem in Philadelphia, because dark-skinned people had more crime and more illness and more homelessness and less education, and they were wondering, what's up with Negroes? Du Bois knew he was being hired for a racist project, and his strategy was to document the way in which history and structural conditions produced what looked like blackness in the city of Philadelphia, which then got tagged as the source of social problems. His task, though, was to reverse the analysis, to identify the way in which those problems were produced on black bodies. So he went door to door. The Philadelphia Negro is an amazing, obsessive sociological study, knocking door to door to look at how many people are living in a house. What are the sanitary conditions? How often is garbage picked up? Who has access to doctors? Who has health problems? Who's allowed into the schools? How many hours do those schools meet? Are those real teachers in those schools? So the first text that grounds my work is The Philadelphia Negro, because he is an unsung hero of the social sciences who dedicated himself to systematic study of history and structure to understand what looked like the personal troubles of an ethnic group. The second shoulder I want to stand on, and these are all really Bill-Young crews, I'm happy to give you more details, is Marie Jahoda. Marie Jahoda was a psychologist, also really a buried treasure in psychology. And in 1933, Marie Jahoda went to a small village in Austria where everybody was unemployed. And she was interested in what are the social dynamics of a community where everyone is unemployed. She was interested in how economic conditions get under the skin. Right? Now notice that she has a beautiful chapter on time, that if you're unemployed, you walk more slowly across the street. Right? That social and historic conditions move under the skin. Not all the time, not always, but they take a toll. The third person from whom I want to draw our attention is a social psychologist by the name of Ignacio Martín Baró. He was he was actually a Spanish psychologist who was a Jesuit priest who dedicated himself to the struggle in El Salvador. And Ignacio Martín Baró was responsible for bringing together liberation theology and liberation psychology. He and his colleagues were murdered in El Salvador, and there's a wonderful book of his writings called The Writings of Liberation Psychology by Ignacio Martín Baró. He only published in Spanish. He said his point was not really to educate Americans, His point was to do research for and with the people of El Salvador, to use social research to expose what he called the dominant lies of government. Right? So all three of these folks were using research to undo stereotypes, to reveal oppression, and to empower communities to think about taking change in their own hands. Du Bois had also under-recognized, he had a performance genre, so that after he did all of his research, people would perform the data down the streets. He was then living in Fisk, because so many African Americans were not literate. So he had this performance genre for performing the history and sociology of the Black community. So with those three forebearers, named, and of course a little bit of Kurt Lewin, I want to move into the work that we're doing now. The We in My Sentence is the public science project at the City University of New York. We are dedicated to doing work that we call critical participatory action research. People know participatory action research? A little maybe? Can I do hard for beginners and that won't be boring? Yeah? Okay. So participatory action research, as its name suggests, it's not a methodology. It's not a way of doing research. It's an epistemology. It's a way about thinking about where does knowledge live, who produces knowledge, and who has expertise. All right? So the P for participation recognizes that knowledge lives in many different kinds of bodies. And even though expertise is widely distributed, legitimacy is not. So the person who cleans this building knows a lot more about your behavior than you know about hers, right? The person who cleans your office knows whether you litter, what you eat, they probably know your name, they know a lot about your very intimate behaviors. The security guards know a lot about you. The way power floats is people who have more power tend not to know very much about people who don't have a lot of power. So when I do work on high schools, I need to talk to push-outs because they have a lot of, I need to talk to kids who have been sitting in special ed, as well as principals and vice principals and parents and teachers, but I need to talk to those folks who have in some ways paid the greatest price for social injustice. So the P recognizes that when we create research teams, they need to be diverse groups of people, where people bring different kinds of knowledge to the work, and we bend to privilege the perspective of those who have paid the highest price for injustice. I will give you examples in a moment, but can you hold on to that? Okay. The kind of PAR that we do is sometimes called contact zone PAR. That is, we bring very differently positioned people together to create research teams, to craft research questions, to gather the data, to analyze the data, and to think about the product. We don't just look at the most oppressed people, although some people do PAR that way. I'm actually interested in messing it up a little bit, right? And so I'm interested in what point of view privileged folks like me have on social arrangements and what point of view young people who are sitting at varied margins have. So that's the P. And we're very serious about deliberately creating these research teams. We have what are called research camps. I will give you an example of how we create that, where we excavate the kind of research capacity in each one of us and give us a set of shared tools so that we can engage with each other in research. The A in PAR is self-explanatory. Participatory action research is dedicated toward action. The action can be theory, it can be policy, it can be organizing, it can be just educating the community about what's happening, but it is not sufficient to write an article in an academic journal and call it a day. Okay? And the R is that it's serious about research. It is not just an organizing project. I have a lot of respect for organizing projects, but PAR begins with a question, not an answer. Does that make sense? So it begins with the question of, why is it that at big high schools in Baltimore or New York, you have 3,000 kids on the register and 200 kids are graduating? That's an honest question, right? That is worth asking. There's nothing natural about that. And we know whose bodies that is, because if those were white middle class bodies, we would have closed those buildings long ago. So PAR begins with the question. Theoretically, we're interested in what we call circuits of dispossession and privilege. Again, I'm happy to send you articles on all of these ideas. We're interested in circuits rather than just communities, because underlying the circuits of dispossession theory is that there are rivers of resources, opportunities, aspirations that are floating between communities and bodies, right? It's not like I want to just study one community as though it exists in isolation. Whether it's wealthy or impoverished, I'm actually interested in how resources and opportunities move between. So that's one version of circuits, the relationship between privilege and dispossession. The other version of circuits is that being dispossessed in one sector of your life, education, leads across to other sectors. So if you are denied a high school diploma because of high stakes testing and you haven't had a real math teacher in 10 years, what else is affected? Obviously your education's affected. Over time, what else is affected?
Job opportunities.
Employment, what else?
Family.
Family, what else?
Health.
Health, what else?
Criminal record.
Criminal record, right? So I was involved, I was an expert witness in a lawsuit in California about high stakes testing disproportionately affecting what's called diploma denial for low-income kids, mostly immigrant kids. And so we did a systematic analysis of if you're denied a high school diploma, what else is affected? Again, I'm happy to send it to you, but every year of education improves your health outcomes. Graduating's a cool thing, but it's not required. 1 year of college, you're less likely to have diabetes, high blood pressure, coronary heart disease, right? The mechanisms are still being determined, but there are these consequences. Education affects fertility, how many babies you have. It affects where you live, whether or not your kids are likely to be exposed to police harassment, right? It affects whether or not you have stable housing, and it definitely affects the likelihood of getting picked up and incarcerated. Not only because if you're a high school dropout, you're more likely to be doing illegal things, but if you're a high school dropout, you're living in a community that is saturated with policing and surveillance that is over-criminalizing them, right? And there are multiple generations of consequences of this, right? So to have a mother who's a high school dropout, many of us do, it has consequences for the next generation, except in the circumstances when it doesn't. So we were interested in circuits of dispossession as they bleed across. And the third version of circuits that we're interested in are the circuits that connect, or what we call circuits of solidarity. That is, under what condition can one get relatively privileged communities to care about what's happening right across the zip code or the barbed wire or the gate in their neighboring communities? Under what conditions can we inspire solidarity? Got it? So circuits are like dynamics rather than characteristics of groups. All right, so I want to give you a bouillon cube of 2 studies and then go into a little more depth on a third, okay? So our first major critical PAR project was in Bedford Hills maximum security facility. It's a prison for women in New York State. It is the maximum security facility in New York State. In 1994, President Clinton took Pell Grants out of prisons. All right, prior to then, and if you were young enough, you need to know this, our country provided Pell Grants to anybody who was eligible. So in 1994, there were 350 college-in-prison programs in this country. When they ripped the Pell Grants out, by 1995, that dropped to 8. All right? So if you work in a prison, one of the things that happens is when the college program goes out of business, the ABE, the GED, the ESL, all of the prior educational experiences diminish because the sense of hope is dashed. Within a very short period of time, the women at Bedford mobilized to bring college back. They invited in women presidents of universities, and they resurrected college within about a year. And so 12 universities gathered as a consortium, each one contributing 2 faculty as part of their workload, okay? And we launched a sociology degree at Bedford Hills, and by the end of that year, 200 of the 600 women at Bedford were back in college, all right? And many, many, many others were in the pre-college program. Got it? Does that make sense? So within a very short period of time, the women in the program said, we need to evaluate this. We need to document its impact because we can no longer take it for granted, right? Before it was just a federal entitlement, but now we knew we'd have to document it. So they asked me if I would evaluate it, and I said I would if we could do a participatory action research project. That is, if we could have women in the prison as part of the research team. So 2 of my graduate students went in, taught a master's course in research methods. They each interviewed 5 other women in prison about their own question. The mother question was, what difference does college and prison make? But they each had their own questions, like, if you're a very religious person, how does it feel to now be in college and learn about racism and capitalism and structure and history, and where it's maybe not all faded, F-A-T-E-D. Somebody else did research on what's it mean to have lived a life of domestic violence. And now, in the words of Iris Bowen, this researcher, see one's own intellectual signature. To learn to write and read and create for oneself. Somebody else did a project on what does college mean for lesbian women who suddenly were doing feminist studies and queer studies and didn't know there were all these fields that one could study. She just thought she was the tomboy in her community. Right? Other people looked at what's the impact of college on our children, on the officers. Right? So by the end of the class, we had 15 students, each of whom had done 5 interviews, so we had 75 interviews. We then asked who wanted to join our research team. 7 of the women did, and we met every other week for 4 years, designing a research project. And it was a rather amazing experience. And again, you can get the whole project on the Public Science Project website. It's called Changing Minds, the Impact of College in a Maximum Security Prison for Women, and it's by Michelle Fine and Kathy Levine and Iris Bowen and Donna Hilton and Maria Torre and a long list of Graduate Center and Bedford Hill researchers. There are some very interesting issues of power that emerge in participatory projects, as you might guess, particularly in a prison. So I'm going to give you one and then I'm going to flip to another story. But so we were all writing. We had collected all this data. We had interviewed the children. We had interviewed women post-release. We had interviewed correction officers who said things like, I hate this program because I led a good life and I don't get free college, and they did something bad, but at least I know at night they're reading and they're not coming back. Right? Couldn't have made up better data, so we took quotes like that and made them postcards. Get tough on crime, educate men and women in prison. But the women also knew that it would be important to support the correction officers. What we didn't want to do is set up a tension between prisoners and correction officers, since people are a moment away from one another given life. And so they did fundraisers every year, and we gave a scholarship to the child of a woman in prison, to the child of a murder victim, some of the women were in for murder, and the child of a correction officer. And then we got the universities to actually offer courses for the correction officers to take as well. One course they took together, sign language, and it was a pretty amazing experience, and they kind of got, because there were a bunch of women who were deaf in the prison, and they got, like, the correction officers and the women got so close that they had to, like, go back through training to remember the kind of us-them distancing, because it was just a human moment. The New York State Department of Corrections did a quantitative analysis for us about the impact of college on recidivism rates using a sample of about 3,000, and what we learned was that Women who had been through who had not been through college had a 30% recidivism rate over 3 years, and women who had an 8%. Right? So then we started lecturing about the cost-benefit analysis. Even if you're conservative Republican, this should be seen as a tax-saving strategy, unless the point is simply to lock Black and Latino people up at the Canadian border. And there is a debate about whether or not that is indeed the point. I will leave you with that thought. That project was extremely cool. We were supposed to be on the cover of Newsweek September 10th, 2001. Needless to say, we weren't. They have not changed the law yet, but there's a lot of momentum around college and prison now, partly because prisons are so expensive and too many of our states have thrown all their money in that direction. And so it's just been very interesting, and I'm happy to answer questions about the mileage. And now most of the women are out, and we're doing projects on formerly incarcerated folks in college, outside, and what obstacles we're actually doing with John Jay, what obstacles they're running into in terms of financial aid, particularly men and women who are on the sex offender registry network, which is a huge, growing, kind of out of control list at this point. Again, might have started as a good idea, grew into just a surveillance criminalizing 18-year-olds having sex with 16-year-olds. And if you're on that register, you get deselected from CUNY. So we're working on kind of the obstacles. Once people are out, have done their time, have served their sentences, have paid back, what are the obstacles they're running into in college? Let me move to polling for justice, which is fun. So remember circuits of dispossession that I was talking about before? So we decided to do a citywide project on circuits of dispossession, looking at young people's experiences of education, healthcare, criminal justice, and housing in New York City. All right? We wanted this to be a PAR project. That means we wanted young people to help us design the project. So we invited about 40 young people to join us in the basement of the Graduate Center, where I teach, in February of 2008. They came from Dream Act kids, undocumented immigrant kids. They came from fancy private schools. They came from special education. They came from AP. They came from the Gay Lesbian Organization. They came from Aspira, Latino immigrant group. They came from Sista to Sista. All right, so a variety, you get the point, a variety of activist groups, fancy, not so fancy, etc. They show up, mostly jackets, hats, you know, like, what is this? Somebody told me to be here. So 40 kids in the basement. I get up and I say, so we're going to do this research project, and really you have a lot of knowledge, and it's your expertise. You can imagine how well that went over. But then I finally said, you know, look, we don't have a lot of time. We have graduate students set up in corners with poster board. And I said, everything that is in your body that is a source of shame, you're not feeling so great about it, or you're made not to feel so great about it, in this room is knowledge. So everybody who knows too much about the criminal justice system, your own history, your cousin, your parents, everybody knows too much about foster care, everybody who loves high stakes tests, and those of you who are a little nervous about it, those of you who know lots about deportation and ICE, immigration. All right, so now there are those of you who have really good experiences with healthcare, and those of you who have a hard time finding healthcare. Those of you living with your parents, and those of you who are not living. All right, so now the jackets are coming off. Yeah, I know a little bit about the criminal justice system. Suddenly the shame to expertise thing is catching on. And they went to the separate corners of the room, and it was their job to craft questions for our citywide survey. Got it? And they also were working with standardized measures, because what we wanted to do was create a survey that would integrate standardized measures with homegrown young people measures. We also had lawyers from the New York Civil Liberties Union. We had Planned Parenthood researchers. We had immigration advocates, adults. And that's what I mean by a context zone. What we wanted were the different kinds of knowledges different groups bring to craft this survey. All right? So it took us about 6 months, and the 40 whittled down to about 10 or 12 regular researchers who met with us. And we created the Polling for Justice, PFJ, survey. I'm going to give you some examples of the kind where we ran into some problems. So not everybody's so comfortable with statistics, like everybody in this room, right? So we had to figure out, so on Saturdays we would have stats for the people. We would throw data up on a screen and young people would join us at the Graduate Center and they would analyze data so that they could figure out what kind of data we wanted to gather. We had to figure out how do we hand this survey out on the street or online, right? Where are we going to get particularly LGBT youth? Where are we going to get kids who are living in foster care? Where are we going to get undocumented kids? How do we get a sample that is reasonably representative, if not random? Right? I can explain all those details. We did it both on the street and online. You can give kids, anybody, you can give movie tickets when people finish the survey. And the good thing about Fandango is they only charge you for the ones that are used. And mostly they didn't use it. Anyway, all right, some good arguments. So the Planned Parenthood folks, anybody here do public health? Anybody have health? Okay, so the Planned Parenthood folks wanted to do what they do. They wanted to know, are you having unsafe sex on the corner of 34th and 5th on Tuesday afternoon without a condom? And the kids are like, we are so not asking those questions. But that is so private. We are just not, right? They didn't want to ask, how much education does your mother have? They didn't want to ask sexuality questions. They didn't want to ask money questions, because those were private, right? And so figuring out how to respect dignity and how to do research that we knew would be important, some of it, right, for policy issues. So we spent a lot of time on this, are we going to ask about sex without a condom? And the Planned Parenthood folks also had to learn that these were not kids to be patted on the head. Like, we were serious that they had a serious point of view, and the Planned Parenthood folks had a serious point of view. So we interrogated a bit, and one of the young people said, I'm so tired of hearing black girls have higher whatevers than white girls do. It's like, so what do we learn? So then we found this article that had been on the lower right-hand side of the New York Times about 3 years ago. It was a study put out by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, that said 1 in 4 girls has an STD, 1 in 2 black girls. That was the headline, okay? You've seen this 1,000 times, you're inoculated to it. So how do most people read that headline? What's it mean? Say the disgusting one, come on, you have to just do it. What do people think when they read that? Yes, thank you.
Right, that the black girls have a better chance of getting an STD or something like that.
Yeah, and the black girls are more promiscuous, and right? So that's where it goes. Those are the tropes that are floating. Doesn't take much to add to those. They're already floating in all of our heads, even if we hate them, right? So we're surrounded. That's our oxygen. So then we called friends at the CDC and we said, because I do sexuality stuff, and I actually knew, you know, age of onset, number of partners, not that much difference. White girls are more likely to use condoms, but everybody's having sex and everybody's having abortions and everybody's having babies, whatever, okay. So I said to my friend at the CDC, how do you explain this? And she said, it actually has nothing to do with number of sex partners. It has to do with the community you live in. And if your community's been affected by mass incarceration, you have higher STDs. It has to do with your sexuality pool rather than, and if prisons handed out condoms, right? Well, that's so interesting because there's your policy issue, right? That reads as a culture issue. Now, did the teenage young women say that's what? No, not really. But that was a bit of what they were resisting, right? And so we created an analytic commitment to only analyze the data on negative outcomes by structural opportunities for education, for health care, access to condoms, access to a healthcare provider you trust. So we'll look at risky behaviors related to those structures, and then we'll look at race connected to those structural opportunities. Do you get what I'm doing? It's like an old W.E.B. Du Bois trick. That is, if we constitute this inside structure and policy, we end up with a different argument than if you just do those race disparity studies that everybody's doing, the conservatives and the progressives, that just read as culture or bad choices, or, right? So that was one kind of issue. We finally distributed the survey. We got the data back, and wow, it's 4:45. All right, I'm going to try to come back to toward an end, so you can see a little clearer. So we got 1,200 young people from New York City to fill out the survey, and it was really pretty amazing. And we mapped the demographics of the New York City public schools, and we tried to get every borough. Anybody know Staten Island? It's so hard to get Staten Island, but we did really well on Queens, Brooklyn, Bronx, and okay. The really good news is, of these 1,200 kids, really unbelievably high rates of I love my school, I love my teacher, I like being challenged in school, I really wish I could get A's. I really want to be a youth activist, I want to make my community better. You know, we couldn't have cooked better. They all want to get PhDs, right? Educational aspirations, a funny question, by the way. But we were really stung by the extraordinarily high rates of negative interactions with police. Now, when I say we, I should say our youth researchers were not surprised by the unbelievably high rates of negative interactions with police, but the adults, particularly those of us who are white, but not only, were really shocked at 60% of kids in the Bronx have had a negative interaction. We asked about, the questions about interactions with police was a homegrown measure, and the kids created it. It's very long, and it's got, I've been given a second chance. I've been helped by a police officer. I've been stopped, I've been frisked, I've been searched, I've been ticketed, I've been arrested, I've been physically hurt, I've been called racial slurs, I've been called sexual slurs. I've been brought in as on a PINS, person in need of supervision. And then we had items like, if I needed help, how likely is it that you would call the police? So 2 years ago, I wasn't doing any work on youth police interactions. It's now almost all the work that we're doing, because what we're now seeing are the ways in which policing is the public sector in poor communities. Military, police, those are not budgets, and incarceration, those are not budgets that are on the chopping block in the ways that education, schooling, testing is also not on the chopping block. It's another conversation. In New York City, we have NYPD in the schools. So there are 5,000 police officers in the schools, and they work for the NYPD, so they don't work for the Board of Ed. So we started gathering stories and then feeding those to the New York Civil Liberties Union, because this research was designed with youth organizations, immigrant organizations, and the New York Civil Liberties, because they were bringing suits around the over-policing of kids in schools. And we were hearing stories the way they were of a little girl at Eastside Community High School, got there early, was running up the steps to meet with her teacher to talk about college. The police officer said, "Where are you going?" She said, "I gotta go up. I gotta talk to him about college. You can't go up. I gotta go up. You can't go up." Kid goes up, the officer grabs her and cuffs her. The principal, Mark Fetterman, comes downstairs and says, "What are you doing? I need to talk to her. I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you." They said, "Well, we've got to arrest her now." This is a 6th through 12 school on 9th and Avenue A. And so he said, "Well, don't perp walk." You know what I mean, perp walk? That in front of all the 6th to 12th graders were lined up. Take her out the back. I'll follow you in my car. So one cop said yes, but another one took her out the front. Mark, principal, put himself at the door. They threw Mark, and they arrested him for interfering with arrest. These stories were starting to emerge in New York. You can just Google Eastside Community High School arrest of child and principal. So we had a lot of data about those. And then we had data about the stop and frisk policies on the streets. Right? And then we learned there's something in New York called the Clean Hallways Act that maybe you know about, where in public housing there are NYPD, and kids are carded all the time, and they need ID. They need ID, and I'm basically my uncle, my grandpa, I don't have, whatever, and so kids are arrested. So just the amount of police presence in young people's lives. And lots of kids said, I've been given a second chance. I've been really helped by police. Deep, profound structural ambivalence about the over-criminalization and the policing. So we have now moved to another project in the Yankee Stadium area where we are systematically surveying every other public housing building. And our team is 4 young men from the community. I wanted, and we got Miss Pearl, who lives on the 6th floor and is scared of the cops, but is also scared of the boys, right? We got a woman who works on domestic violence issues, because the question is not just the over-policing of young people of color, which of course that is, but how does one create safety in communities that have been so disinvested by everything but police, right? And so they're collecting these data, and again, it's kind of amazing how much negative interaction there is, but also how much yearning there is for security, to be safe, to be able to stand on a street corner with friends. Things that particularly those of us who are white wouldn't believe. And I have to say, when I talk about this in communities of color, it's like no surprise, hello, where have you been? And when I talk about them in communities like me, people are like, Shop, are you sure? Is it true? Have you confirmed? So we took the in case you're wondering that, we took the my colleague Brett Stout is at John Jay, took the NYPD data and did a secondary analysis of that with the kids. So now we have Polling for Justice and NYPD, both demonstrating the over-arresting and stopping and frisking of kids of color in low-income communities, with between 90 and 94% of these are innocent stops. Okay? So that's deep. And we ask kids, like, how many times have you been stopped in the last 6 months? And they're like, Miss, I can't count. And like, what did they say? And I don't want to be disrespectful, but, right? And so it's race and it's gender. Anybody else know what other group has unbelievably high rates of negative encounters with police?
Transgender.
Huh? LGBT. You got it, LGBT. Unbelievably high rates, unbelievably high rates. So we've got a project now with LGBT youth, and we go to the street corners and we do interviews on the streets. They're like data-driven focus groups. Instead of asking people their experience, we say, explain these data, right? And people are now, these young people are writing policy. And we just did a project, part of what I'm showing you are another version of circuits, how these research projects move to activism and move to making visible that which is well known in some communities and invisible in others, right? I want to say 2 more quick things, and then I'm going to turn to the video and then we'll have more questions. So, as we were doing this work, I got a call from a friend of mine in Oregon that 2 young women were sexting each other, 2 young African-American women on their phones. You know what I mean? Anybody know what I mean by sexting? I don't know what I mean. Okay, so they were doing that. And one was 16 and one was 18. 16-year-old's mom found the phone, gave it to the police. 18-year-old went to prison for engaging in sexting with a minor and child porn. But there were no like the child was in her adorable cheerleader outfit, right? So I got a call from a friend in Oregon saying, Michelle, can you help? So we did some raising money, and we decided to do a conference together on LGBT young people, that's oversexed and under surveillance, around how they're managing policing and media. So we had a conference a few months ago with our colleagues in Oregon and in New York City. So the Graduate Center was filled with like 50 young LGBT, lots of trans young people came at night. The security officers are calling me saying, somebody who says she's Sharon Smith, but the ID says Stephen Lanama, but right? So it was fantastic. And we had our Oregon colleagues online, and these 2 young women, the one is now 18 and the other is now grown up, and they were like on Oprah. And the New York crowd was very political, as you can imagine. And these 2 young women from Oregon weren't. It was like totally boring. You know, they were like, well, how do you feel like you started a movement? Asked one of the New York young people, and they're like, I don't know, I just wanted to talk to her on the phone. So it's pretty amazing. Anyway, so there are all these circuits of policy, of organizing. The last circuit I will give you a taste of is, like W.E.B. Du Bois, we decided to move to theater. A lot of our research, when we started to get the data back, Maddie Fox, who's the director of this project, is trained in theater, the oppressed, and playback theater. And she would use body and movement as a way to analyze the data, because sometimes the data were really depressing, right? This is interesting for us, maybe. This is hard for some of us, because this isn't an abstract story. When you have young people analyzing the conditions of their own lives, it's not just exhilarating. I don't think we cause depression. We can deal with that. You know, one little girl got asked, don't you feel bad studying racism? She said, I knew about racism before I met Michelle Fine, but now you can research it and some white people care and you can perform it and go to city council in Albany. But it's not easy. And there were times when Maddie would say the group would just shut down, right? Like when we did analyses of what does it mean to have a mother who's a high school dropout push out for student outcomes, for young people's outcomes. And so she would have them perform it, move it, embody the affect. So the young people were trained and now perform the data in a variety of settings, and I'll show you a clip. Let me just tell you two other findings, though. Again, you can read the data. The big news is not news at all. The more dispossessed you are in education, in housing, in criminal justice, that is, you've been pushed out of school or dropped out of school, you're not living with your family, or you're in a homeless shelter, or you've been gentrified out of your community, you've been picked up by the cops, you don't have access to a good health care provider, that's a 4 for 4. Those kids have really crummy outcomes compared to other kids. But not entirely. Really important, not entirely. Lots don't, lots survive, lots are amazing, right? And we were interested analytically in, can we identify circuit breakers? That is, even for young people who have every structural condition against them. Are there some conditions that can mediate dispossession and negative outcomes? And by negative outcomes, I mean engage in violence, depressed, involved in criminal justice, drinking, drugs, unsafe sex, all right? I'm not calling those at risk, because I don't really like that language. But the language we're now using is if young people have access to certain conditions, they get themselves out of harm's way. Because they are living in circumstances that we have designed that put them in harm's way. We have put them at risk. So the question is, do they, and so the big circuit breakers, which is good news for how many of you are in human services? Educate, yeah. So the good news for circuit breakers, for those of you who care about sense of community, is kids who feel like their teachers believe in them, kids who participate in a community-based youth organization. Those kids, even if they have very high levels of dispossession, are much less likely to engage in those outcomes. What's interesting about that is there are neuroscientists like Bruce McEwen who would argue that the higher what he calls the allostatic load, environmental stressors, they move right into your body. So you have a lot of stress on your body, and it moves into high blood pressure. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Right? So like some days you feel a little high blood pressure-y more than others. So if that's cumulative, not only do you feel it, but you bounce back less well with the next trauma. So a cop stops you in school, maybe you got through it, but your resistance is down, right? So in the neuroscience literature, the studies of allostatic load, the only mediator that they have found is what they call maternal responsiveness. Now what I like about that is it shows us that it's not automatic, bad things, blood pressure. What I don't like about that is it's a little mother blaming. Okay, so we were actually like, oh, she's not maternally responsive, she has 4 jobs, she's undocumented, whatever. So what I like is that we started searching for these circuit breakers. What I want to show you now is a little clip from Polling for Justice, and leave you with the sense that critical participatory research is a way of universities understanding that we have a debt to communities, cultivating the gifts of young people that are in the funniest bodies, and speaking back to policies that are eating communities with a sense of organizing and possibilities. So let's see if I can. I think this is 5 minutes.